Michael Sullivan stared at the investment portfolio spreadsheet on his computer screen, the numbers swimming before his tired eyes. After 30 years of managing other people's money at Sullivan and Partners, he thought he'd seen it all. But the discrepancy in front of him made his stomach churn. Something wasn't adding up in the firm's main investment fund, and the irregularities all seemed to lead back to his brother and business partner, James. The autumn sun was setting outside his corner office in downtown Boston, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk where he'd built his legacy. At 62, Michael had everything he'd ever wanted: a successful business, a beautiful wife, 2 grown children, and a reputation for integrity that had taken decades to build. But in the past few months, small things had begun to nag at him: hushed conversations that stopped when he entered the room, subtle changes in client account statements, and James's increasingly erratic behavior. "Everything okay in here?" Sarah, his wife of 35 years, appeared in the doorway. Even after all this time, the sight of her still made his heart skip a beat. She'd stopped by to take him to dinner, as she often did on Friday evenings. Her presence was a welcome distraction from the troubling thoughts that had been plaguing him. "Just finishing up some paperwork," he lied, quickly minimizing the spreadsheet. The weight of his suspicions felt like a physical burden, but he couldn't bring himself to share them with her. Not yet. Not until he was certain. Sarah's perfectly manicured hand came to rest on his shoulder. "You've been working too hard lately, Michael. Dr. Reynolds mentioned your blood pressure was up at your last checkup." Her concern was genuine, but there was something else in her voice, a tension he couldn't quite place. I know," he sighed, patting her hand. "Just give me 5 minutes to wrap things up here." As Sarah left to wait in the reception area, Michael pulled up his email. A message from Tony Martinez, the firm's head accountant, caught his eye: "Need to discuss sensitive matter. Meet tomorrow. Urgent." Tony had been with the company for 20 years, and he wasn't one for dramatics. If he said it was urgent, it was. Michael's phone buzzed, a text from James: "Heard you were asking questions about the Peterson account. Don't. Some stones are better left unturned, brother." The message sent a chill down his spine. The Peterson account was their largest client, worth over $50 million. Michael had noticed unusual transfer patterns in the account last week, but James had brushed off his concerns with a casual explanation about tax optimization strategies. As he gathered his things to leave, Michael's eyes fell on the family photo on his desk, taken at last year's Christmas party. James stood next to him, both of them smiling, their wives on either side, the perfect picture of successful siblings in business together. Had he missed something? Had he been too trusting, too willing to look the other way when things didn't quite add up? Walking through the empty office, Michael noticed light still streaming from under James's door. He paused, hand raised to knock, but then thought better of it. Through the frosted glass, he could make out his brother's silhouette, hunched over his desk, talking intently on the phone. "Everything needs to be moved by next week," James's muffled voice carried through the door. "Yes, all of it." "No, Michael doesn't know anything." "Keep it that way." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped back from the door. The words could have been about anything: a surprise birthday party, a real estate deal, a legitimate business transaction. But deep down, he knew better. 30 years of instinct told him something was very wrong. In the elevator ride down to meet Sarah, Michael's mind raced. The irregularities in the accounts, James's defensive behavior, the urgent message from Tony, it all pointed to something he didn't want to face. But what troubled him most wasn't the possibility of financial misconduct, it was the growing suspicion that the betrayal might run deeper than money. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Michael saw Sarah through the glass doors, talking on her phone, her back turned to him. She was gesturing animatedly, and even from this distance, her body language screamed agitation. Just before he pushed through the doors, he caught a fragment of her conversation. "He's starting to ask questions." "No, I don't think he knows yet, but we need to move faster." Sarah quickly ended the call as he approached, greeting him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ready for dinner, darling?" Michael forced a smile in return, even as his world began to tilt on its axis. "Ready as I'll ever be." As they walked to their favorite restaurant, arm in arm like any other Friday evening, Michael felt the weight of unspoken questions pressing down on him. In the gathering darkness of the Boston evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a storm, one that threatened to destroy everything he'd spent his life building. Sleep eluded Michael that night. Sarah's whispered phone conversation echoed in his mind as he lay beside her, listening to her steady breathing. In 35 years of marriage, he'd never doubted her loyalty, but now every memory seemed to take on new shadows, new meanings. He thought of the late-night texts she'd been receiving lately, the unexplained afternoons out, the sudden interest in their financial paperwork. Dawn found him in his home office, surrounded by years of financial records he'd brought home. The morning light crept through the window as he pieced together a disturbing pattern. Client funds had been quietly moving through a series of offshore accounts, each transfer carefully disguised as legitimate investments. The amounts were significant, millions of dollars siphoned away so skillfully that it had taken him months to notice. His phone buzzed. Tony Martinez's message was brief: "Meetings off. Leaving town for a while. Sorry." Michael's hands trembled as he dialed Tony's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Something had spooked their longtime accountant, and Michael had a sickening feeling he knew why. The sound of Sarah's heels clicking on the hardwood floors made him quickly shut down his laptop. She appeared in the doorway, elegant as always in her cream business suit. "Early start?" she asked, sipping her morning coffee. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, studying her face. Was that a flicker of concern in her eyes, or guilt? "Sarah, we need to talk about." Her phone chimed, and she glanced at it. "Sorry, darling, I'm running late. Lunch with Caroline." She kissed his cheek, the familiar scent of her perfume now somehow suffocating. "Don't work too hard." Caroline. James's wife. The same Caroline who had been acting strangely at their last family dinner, watching Michael with what he now recognized as pity in her eyes. How long had they all known? How long had he been the fool in this elaborate deception? At the office, Michael found James's door locked, his secretary claiming he was in meetings all day. Through his own sources at the firm, Michael discovered that James had been making frequent trips to the Cayman Islands over the past year, trips that had never been mentioned at their weekly partner meetings. By noon, Michael had confirmed his worst fears. The Peterson account wasn't the only one that had been compromised. Nearly a third of their major client accounts showed similar patterns of suspicious transfers. The numbers were staggering, over $200 million potentially misappropriated. His secretary buzzed him. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan is here to see you." Michael's heart jumped, but it was Caroline, not Sarah, who walked into his office. James's wife looked tired, her usual polished appearance somewhat frayed at the edges. She closed the door behind her, hands clasped tightly together. "I can't do this anymore, Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to know the truth." "About the missing money?" Michael asked, his throat tight. Caroline's laugh was bitter. "The money? Oh, Michael, that's just the beginning. They think I don't know everything, but I've been watching them for months." Sarah and James, she stopped, tears welling in her eyes. Before she could continue, Michael's phone rang. It was Lieutenant Derek Foster from the Boston Police Department, an old friend from his college days. "Mike, you need to get down to Mass General right away. It's about Tony Martinez." Michael's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "Car accident on the way to the airport. He's in critical condition, but before they took him into surgery, he kept saying your name. And Mike, it wasn't an accident. Someone cut his brake lines." The room seemed to spin. Caroline was watching him, her face pale. They found out he was going to talk to you, didn't they? She asked quietly. A text message flashed on his phone, from Sarah. Where are you? We need to talk. Meet me at the lake house. Come alone. The lake house. Their weekend retreat in the Berkshires, where they'd spent so many happy summers with the children. Now it felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. Don't go, Caroline said, reading the message over his shoulder. Michael, please. You don't understand what they're capable of. I've seen. She stopped as the office door opened. James stood in the doorway, his expensive suit immaculate as always. Behind him, Michael caught a glimpse of Sarah in the reception area, her face unreadable. Caroline, darling, James said smoothly, what a surprise to find you here. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Having a nice chat with my brother? Michael watched as Caroline's face drained of color. In that moment, he realized that the comfortable world he'd inhabited for decades had been nothing but an elaborate facade. Behind the family dinners, the shared vacations, the business partnerships, and loving marriages lay a web of deceit so intricate he was only beginning to glimpse its true extent. As James stepped into the office and closed the door behind him, Michael felt the weight of a decision pressing down on him. He could confront them now, demand answers, risk everything in a moment of righteous anger. Or he could play along, pretend he knew nothing, and try to understand just how deep this betrayal went. Looking at his brother's calculating smile and remembering Tony Martinez fighting for his life in a hospital bed, Michael made his choice. The time for trust was over. Michael sat in his parked car outside Mass General, watching the sunset paint the Boston skyline in shades of amber and gold. He'd spent hours by Tony Martinez's bedside, watching machines breathe for the man who might hold the keys to unraveling this whole conspiracy. The doctors weren't optimistic. The accident had left Tony with severe internal injuries and head trauma. His phone showed 17 missed calls, 8 from Sarah, 5 from James, 3 from their daughter Emily, and 1 from their son David. The last one made his heart ache. David had always idolized his uncle James, even following in his footsteps to become an investment banker. How would he handle learning the truth about the man he'd modeled his life after? A soft knock on his car window startled him. Caroline stood there, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Her eyes darted nervously around the parking garage as Michael unlocked the passenger door. I had my driver drop me off 2 blocks away, she whispered, sliding into the seat. James thinks I'm at my sister's. She pulled out a thick manila envelope from her bag. I've been gathering evidence for months. Bank statements, travel records, photographs, they've been planning this for years, Michael. Michael's hands trembled as he opened the envelope. The first photograph showed Sarah and James at a cafe in Geneva, dated 18 months ago. The timestamp showed it was during the week Sarah had claimed to be at a spa retreat in Arizona. They sat close, heads together, reviewing documents spread across the table. I hired a private investigator last year, Caroline continued, her voice hollow. At first, I thought James was just having an affair. I could have handled that. But this. She pulled out more documents. They've been systematically draining client accounts, moving money through a network of shell companies. But the real mystery is what they're doing with it all. The money isn't sitting in offshore accounts, it's being spent on something massive. When did you first suspect? Michael asked, his throat tight. Caroline's laugh was bitter. Looking back, there were signs for years. The way they'd exchange looks at family dinners. How they always seemed to have private jokes. The late-night phone calls James claimed were about work. She wiped away a tear. But I think I truly knew the night of your anniversary party last year. Michael remembered the party, their 35th wedding anniversary. The children had organized it, surprising them with a beautiful celebration at the Four Seasons. What happened? I overheard them in the hotel garden. Sarah was worried about something going wrong with their plan. James. Caroline's voice caught. James told her not to worry, that you were too trusting to ever suspect your own wife. He said your blind faith in family was your greatest weakness. The words hit Michael like physical blows. He thought of all the family moments that now felt tainted, Christmases, birthdays, vacations. Had any of it been real? Had Sarah ever truly loved him, or had he just been a convenient mark in their long con? His phone buzzed again, another text from Sarah. The lake house isn't a request, Michael. There are things you need to understand. Come alone, or Emily pays the price. Cold fear gripped his heart. Emily? What does she mean about Emily? Caroline's face paled. Your daughter's art gallery. The one that's been doing so well lately. James arranged all the major buyers. Every significant purchase has been through shell companies they control. They've made Emily dependent on them without her even knowing it. Michael's mind raced. They'd compromised his daughter's business, turned his son's mentor into a fraud, and destroyed the foundation of his marriage. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. A new text arrived, this one from an unknown number, with a photo attachment. Michael's blood ran cold as he opened it. The image showed Emily at her gallery, talking to a man whose face wasn't visible. The message read, "She's had such a successful year. Would be a shame if certain transactions came under federal investigation." They're watching her right now, Caroline whispered. They're watching all of us. Michael stared at the hospital building looming before them, thinking of Tony fighting for his life inside. One man had already paid the price for trying to expose the truth. How many others had been silenced? His phone rang again, David this time. Michael let it go to voicemail, unable to trust his voice. How could he tell his children that their comfortable world was built on lies? That their mother and uncle had constructed an elaborate fraud that threatened to destroy not just their family, but countless others who had trusted the Sullivan name? What are you going to do? Caroline asked softly. Michael looked at the lake house message again. Sarah and James clearly thought they had him cornered, using his love for his children as leverage. They expected him to either cave to their demands or confront them in angry desperation. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed his trust in family was a weakness, never considering that it might be his greatest strength. Because while they had been busy weaving their web of deception, Michael had spent decades building genuine relationships, with clients, employees, and friends in positions of power. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Judge Harrison. It's Michael Sullivan. I need your help, and we don't have much time. The pieces were in place. Now he just had to figure out how to protect his children while bringing down the people he had loved most in the world. The lake house stood silent against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with warm light that once meant home and safety. Michael sat in his car, watching shadows move behind the curtains while Judge Harrison's words echoed in his mind, everything's in place. Just keep them talking for 30 minutes. And Michael, be careful. People are most dangerous when they're cornered. His hand brushed against the small recording device in his pocket, military-grade equipment rushed to him by an FBI contact. In the trunk lay copies of all the evidence Caroline had gathered, secured in a lockbox that would be opened by specific parties if anything happened to him tonight. The gravel crunched under his feet as he approached the house. Each step stirred memories, teaching David to fish off the dock, Emily learning to swim in the shallow cove, Sarah's laughter during summer evenings on the porch. Had any of it been real? Or had each precious memory been tainted by calculation and deceit? The door opened before he could reach for it. Sarah stood there, elegant even in casual clothes, her face a mask of concern. Michael, thank God you came. We need to talk about what you think you know. The familiar scent of her perfume hit him as he stepped inside, jasmine and vanilla, the same fragrance he'd given her on their first anniversary. How many other men had breathed in that scent while he trusted blindly? James sat in the living room, nursing a glass of the expensive scotch he'd always preferred. The same scotch they'd shared when James had asked to become partners in the firm. "Brother," he said, raising his glass. "Glad you could join us for this family meeting." "Where's Emily?" Michael demanded, remaining standing. "Safe," Sarah assured him, moving to stand near James. The casual way they positioned themselves together spoke of years of practiced intimacy. "She's at her gallery opening in New York. We just wanted your attention." "You have it." Michael's voice was steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Why don't you start by explaining why Tony Martinez is fighting for his life in Mass General?" A flicker of something, guilt, fear, crossed Sarah's face, but James merely sipped his scotch. "Tragic accident. The man really should have had his car serviced more regularly. Like you should have been more careful with the Peterson account." Michael watched their reactions carefully. Or was that just the tip of the iceberg? "Sit down, Michael," Sarah said softly. "Please. This isn't what you think." "Then what is it?" The pain in his voice was raw, real. "Help me understand, Sarah. Help me understand 35 years of lies." "Not lies," she protested. "Protection. We were protecting you." James set down his glass. "The world isn't as simple as you've always wanted to believe, brother. Sometimes maintaining order requires compromises." "Compromises?" Michael's laugh was bitter. "Is that what we're calling fraud and attempted murder now? You don't understand what's really at stake." Sarah moved toward him, her hand outstretched. "We're part of something bigger. Something necessary." "Necessary?" The recording device felt heavy in his pocket. "Just 15 more minutes." "Necessary for whom?" "For everyone." James stood, his confidence wavering for the first time. "The money, it's not what you think. We're not stealing it. We're investing it in humanity's future." Sarah nodded earnestly. "There are things happening, Michael. Things most people aren't ready to know about. James and we're helping prepare for what's coming." The pieces started clicking together, the massive expenditures, the secret meetings, the elaborate deceptions. "My God," Michael whispered. "You've joined some kind of cult." "A movement," James corrected sharply. "A group of visionaries who understand what's really happening in the world. The societal collapse that's coming, the need for preparation." Sarah's eyes held a fanatic gleam Michael had never seen before. "We've built something, Michael. Secure compounds, stockpiles, infrastructure. When everything falls apart, we'll be ready. We could protect our children, our grandchildren. By stealing from others? By trying to kill a man who trusted us? By making hard choices?" James slammed his hand on the table. "The weak survive because the strong make difficult decisions. I've tried to teach you that for years, but you never understood. Always too concerned with ethics, with playing by rules made by lesser men." Michael thought of his children, of the legacy of lies they'd been living. "And Caroline? Does she understand these hard choices you've made?" A shadow crossed James's face. "Caroline's become a liability. Like you're becoming now." Sarah moved closer, her voice gentle but her eyes hard. "It's not too late, Michael. Join us. Help us protect our family. Or..." The threat hung in the air, heavy with decades of shared history and shattered trust. Michael looked at his wife, this stranger wearing Sarah's face, and felt a profound grief for the life he'd thought they'd shared. "Or what?" he asked quietly. "You'll arrange another accident?" The sound of vehicles on the gravel driveway made them all freeze. Through the window, Michael saw black SUVs surrounding the house, their headlights cutting through the gathering dark. Sarah's face crumpled in realization. "What have you done?" "The same thing you taught me," Michael replied, his heart breaking even as steel entered his voice. I made a hard choice to protect what matters. James lunged for his briefcase, but the doors were already bursting open, FBI agents flooding the room with practiced efficiency. As his wife and brother were read their rights, Michael watched the last pieces of his old life crumble away. In his pocket, the recording device captured it all, every confession, every threat, every moment of truth. But it couldn't capture the cost, the death of love, the end of trust, the shattering of a family's foundation. Through the window, he saw Caroline emerging from one of the vehicles, surrounded by federal agents. Their eyes met across the chaos, and in that moment, Michael knew that the Real storm was just beginning. The morning after the arrests, Michael found himself in Emily's New York gallery, surrounded by her artwork. Each piece told a story of connection and loss, though his daughter had never known how prophetic her themes would become. She stood before him now, her artist's hands trembling as she held the documentation proving how her success had been manipulated. "All of them," she whispered. "Every major sale?" "Not all," Michael said gently. "Your talent is real, Emily. They just twisted it to their purposes." He watched his daughter absorb this truth, seeing echoes of his own pain in her eyes. The gallery's morning light filtered through the high windows, catching the tears on Emily's cheeks. "I keep thinking about Mom's face at my first opening. How proud she looked. Was that real? Was any of it real?" Michael reached for her hand, remembering all the times Sarah had truly been there for their children, the scraped knees, the broken hearts, the graduation celebrations. "The love was real," he said finally. "The person she became, that's what wasn't real." David arrived an hour later, still wearing his investment banker's suit, his face ashen. He'd spent the night reviewing client accounts, helping federal investigators trace the labyrinth of financial fraud. "The Peterson account was just the beginning," he said, his voice hollow. "Uncle James, he taught me everything I know about finance. How do I trust my own judgment now?" The weight of their shared disillusionment filled the room. But as Michael watched his children grappling with the truth, he saw something else emerging, a fierce determination that reminded him of their childhood resilience. "We need to protect the innocent clients," David said, straightening his shoulders. "I've been working on a recovery plan. If we liquidate certain assets, restructure the firm." Emily moved to her latest installation, a series of broken mirrors that captured and reflected light in unexpected ways. "I'm going to host an exhibition," she declared. "Real clients only. No shell companies, no hidden agendas. Just honest appreciation of art." Their strength humbled him. While he'd been focusing on exposing the conspiracy, his children were already thinking about rebuilding, about protecting others from the damage their family name could cause. The gallery door chimed, and Caroline entered, looking both exhausted and somehow lighter. The burden of secrets had aged her, but now that everything was in the open, her natural grace was returning. "Tony's awake," she announced. "The doctors say he'll make a full recovery." She paused, meeting Michael's eyes. "He's been asking for you. There's more to tell." Michael nodded, unsurprised. The investigation was revealing layers upon layers of deception. The survivalist compound wasn't just a bunker in the woods, it was part of a network that stretched across continents, involving powerful people who believed they could buy salvation while the world burned. "Have you been to see them?" Emily asked Caroline softly. "Mom and Uncle James?" Caroline shook her head. "Not yet. But their lawyers have been in contact. They're offering deals, trying to trade information for leniency." Her voice caught. "James asked about the children." Sarah left a letter for you, Michael." The sealed envelope felt heavy in his hands. Sarah's familiar handwriting brought a fresh wave of grief, not for what he'd lost, but for what had never truly existed. "You don't have to read it," David said protectively. But he did. Because beneath the betrayal and pain, beneath the anger and disillusionment, there were still questions that needed answers. Not just about the conspiracy, but about the human heart's capacity for both deception and love. The letter began, "My dearest Michael, by the time you read this." As he read, Emily and David moved closer, their hands finding his shoulders. Caroline watched from nearby, her presence a reminder that family could be rebuilt from the ashes of what was lost. Outside the gallery windows, New York continued its eternal rhythm. People hurried past, carrying their own hidden stories of love and betrayal, strength and weakness. Inside, the broken mirrors of Emily's installation caught the morning light, fragmenting it into countless small revelations. They were all broken mirrors now, reflecting different pieces of the same shattered truth. But as Michael looked at his children, at Caroline, at the strength they were finding in their shared pain, he understood something profound. Sometimes things must break completely before they can be remade into something stronger, something more honest, something real. The letter ended with words that would haunt him for years to come: "The hardest part wasn't betraying you. The hardest part was realizing that somewhere along the way, I betrayed myself." 1 year later, Michael stood at the window of his new office, watching the first snow of winter dust the Boston streets. The view was different, a smaller building, a humbler space, but the sense of purpose was stronger than ever. On his desk sat a framed photo of Emily's latest gallery opening, her genuine success now untainted by manipulation. Beside it, a newspaper article highlighted David's work in establishing a foundation for victims of financial fraud. The morning's mail included a thick envelope from the federal prosecutor's office. Inside was the final settlement agreement for the victims of Sullivan and Partners fraud. Michael had surrendered almost everything he owned to help make them whole, but the weight of that sacrifice felt light compared to the burden of unwitting complicity he'd carried before. His phone buzzed, a text from Caroline: "Tony's testimony just finished. Last of the hidden accounts exposed. It's really over." But was anything truly over? The trials had revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, dozens of wealthy families channeling billions into a network of doomsday compounds across 3 continents. Sarah and James had been just 2 nodes in a vast web of delusion and deceit. Their sentences, 18 years each, seemed both too much and too little for the damage they'd caused. The elevator chimed, and Emily walked in, carrying her leather portfolio and a familiar determination in her eyes. "The gallery's ready for tonight," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "David's flying in from London. He says the European recovery team has secured the last of the hidden assets." Michael smiled at his daughter, marveling at how adversity had strengthened rather than broken her. The exhibition she'd mentioned was titled "Reflections on Truth," a series exploring the aftermath of betrayal and the unexpected beauty found in rebuilding. "Have you read it yet?" Emily asked softly, nodding toward the unopened letter on his desk. "Sarah's final communication, delivered through her lawyers yesterday. The 3rd such letter since her imprisonment." "Not yet." Michael touched the envelope. The first letter had been full of justifications, the second of regrets. He wasn't sure he was ready for what this one might contain. "Mom asked about you in her last call," Emily said, her voice carefully neutral. Their weekly prison visits were something she and David had decided to maintain, not for Sarah's sake, but for their own healing. "She's different now. The medication, the therapy, she's starting to understand what she lost." The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Sullivan. Judge Harrison is here." Robert Harrison entered with the same commanding presence he'd had since their law school days, but his smile was warmer now, tempered by shared experience. "The papers are ready, Michael. Once you sign, the new firm structure will be official. Sullivan Recovery and Advocacy Group, a phoenix risen from the ashes of their family's disgrace. The firm would specialize in helping victims of financial fraud rebuild their lives, with a special focus on cases involving betrayal by trusted family members. Before we start," Harrison said, "there's something you should know. I visited James yesterday." Michael's hand stilled over the papers. He hadn't seen his brother since the sentencing. He's writing a book, Harrison continued. About the psychology of betrayal, about how true believers can justify anything. The proceeds will go to the victims' fund. Emily reached for her father's hand. People can change, Dad. Not enough to undo what they did, but enough to remind us that humanity exists even in the darkest places, Michael finished. He thought of Sarah's letter, still unopened. Perhaps it was time. The afternoon light caught Emily's latest piece, hung on his office wall, a sculpture of broken glass and gold, inspired by the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making the scars part of its beauty. You know what I've learned? Emily said, following his gaze to the artwork. Trust isn't about being unbreakable. It's about how we choose to rebuild after we're broken. Michael opened Sarah's letter, his children's strength giving him courage. Her familiar handwriting filled the page. Michael. I've spent a year trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt the people I loved most. The truth is both simpler and more complex than I wanted to believe. We don't become monsters in a single moment, we do it in small compromises, in quiet betrayals, in the lies we tell ourselves about our own goodness. But I've also learned that the capacity for change, for genuine remorse, exists even in the darkness we create. I don't ask for forgiveness, I haven't earned it. Instead, I write to tell you that watching you and our children rise from the ashes of my betrayal has taught me more about true strength than all my years of calculated survival ever did. You've built something beautiful from the wreckage of our life together. Not just the new firm or Emily's art or David's advocacy, but a different kind of legacy, one built on truth, on healing, on helping others find light in their own darkness. I'll carry the weight of what I destroyed until my last breath. But knowing that our children learned about resilience, about integrity, about the real meaning of family through your example, that gives me a kind of peace I never found in all our years of deception. Take care of them, Michael. And remember that even in a world of shadows, love can be real. Sarah. Michael folded the letter carefully, feeling the complex web of emotions it stirred, grief, anger, acceptance, and something like peace. Outside his window, the snow was falling harder now, covering the city in a clean white blanket. Emily squeezed his hand. Ready to sign those papers? He looked at his daughter, at Judge Harrison, at the photo of David on his desk. He thought of Caroline, of Tony Martinez, of all the people who had helped him find his way back to truth. The broken pieces of his life had been reformed into something different, something harder but also more genuine. Ready, he said, picking up his pen. After all, every signature was a choice, every moment a chance to reaffirm who we truly are. The sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across his desk, but shadows held no fear for him now. He had learned to see in the dark, to find strength in broken places, to build truth from the ashes of lies. And in that knowledge, there was a different kind of love, one tempered by fire, tested by pain, and ultimately made stronger by survival.